my goodness. Well, how you doing there? It's thundering and lightning outside. Brutal. Let's see if the power goes out while I'm making this video. If it does, I'll leave it in. You know, I know people have a hard time wrapping their brain around, and I didn't know this until later in life, really. You know, moving three-dimensional geometries. Tesla said that he could build machines in his mind and take them apart again and run them for countless thousands of hours to test the wear and the breakage on the machines, not by building it, but just by running it in his brain. People all have different minds, and I know kind of visualization of some of this stuff might be slightly hard for people, but I'm going to try to keep the terminology as simple as possible. By the way, I have a glossary below for 99% of the terminology that I use, and I'm never, ever trying to use big words. I mean, that's just antithetical to trying to get a point across. I think it's the ultimate hypocrisy and, well, not very bright for anybody to intentionally use any form of large terminology. To me, like geomagnetic procession is not that complicated. I like to talk about something that nobody else talks about. And of course, you can find articles on geomagnetic procession, i.e. the Lamore frequency, and they of course call it the magnetic moment, but that doesn't explain anything. But they actually don't tell you what's going on, and neither has the term field nor energy been defined by any of these, well, let's just put it mildly, this kooky people who are in fact, of course, materialists. Most of the things and everything, of course, is unified in this universe are extremely simple, and yet people don't think in terms of that simplicity. They like to pigeonhole things. I mean, we got different words for different states of water. Ice, water, steam, of course, they're all one thing. We have a different term for the loss of energy of the dielectric. What if we actually referred to the battery as one term? Let's just say battery. But when we actually hook up leads to the positive and negative and the energy drawn from it, we called it something different, the energy that's drawn from this battery. It's like, well, that's used for communication, but these are, of course, just one thing and one thing only. Just as magnetism is a dielectric field, magnetism would be ice relative to the dielectric being water. That's kind of a crude analogy, but things are really very simple. The South, of course, on a, this not also too been explained by science at all. It's called the cold cathode effect. When the actual anode heats, the cathode chills, even though they're completely separate, and even if you suck all the air out and put it in a vacuum, you know, there's nothing communicating between the two. How does the anode know to heat when the cathode chills, or how does the cathode know to chill when the anode heats? People forget that in the case of the magnetic field that it actually is moving. This is a neat little toy. It's called a toroflux. It's basically a toroidal slinky, one of the fun things people will do with it. And it's a really cheap toy. I kind of have to stand back to do this as you put it on your arm, and people, you know, take it from one arm to the next. You know, you can see that the torus is moving. This, of course, is not how a magnetic torus moves, but it essentially is. And this, of course, the mean frequency is 42 megahertz, which is 42 million hertz. I mean, that's an extremely fast movement. That's the mean. It actually varies depending on a lot of other variables, kind of like a car. It's like, well, what's the speed of a car? It's like, well, I don't know. How much are you pressing on the gas pedal? That's, of course, its speed, a lot of other factors, how heavy it is, how it actually corners, and the same is actually true of the magnetic field and how it corners. The geomagnetic procession, and I'm about to spin up a gyroscope here, depends on many different variables, including its weight, the size of the flywheel, the spatial footprint of the flywheel. And people actually talk about the geomagnetic processional effect or gyroscopic effect in the case of, and I've seen all that guy's videos. What's his name again? We're not talking about Lee Skowlin. We're talking about, in like 1960s videos, the guy demonstrates like a million different gyroscopes. I've watched all the videos. I forget his name. They forget, they're talking about, you know, the magic of the gyroscope, how it loses weight, and all these other things. And they're forgetting about the air, which of course is here, and the friction on the bearings, and all the other things regarding a gyroscope. There is a field flywheel, and that field flywheel, of course, is the torus. But what they forget is it's actually spinning in an invisible medium. That's the reason for everything that makes life possible, space possible, time possible, charge possible, everything possible. There's a neat other video, I can't talk about it here, but that water is self-assembling, by the way, and there's a fundamental hyperlogic behind that. We have oxygen over here and hydrogen over here, that actually water self-assembles. That almost seems kind of magical, and it kind of is if you think about it, but that is a premise for another video. But it is true that water itself, given the components, does self-assemble. That's kind of a large statement, but it's absolutely true. I'll talk about that in a different video. But people forget that the magnetic field is moving. You can actually type in a little more frequency or a geomagnetic procession, meaning, of course, that magnetism is governed by and is held within the parameters of hysteresis and induction. And I know these seem like big words, and I'll make it really simple. When we were young, we would kind of like be in a pool and we'd slap our hand on the water, and we found out as little kids if we did it really fast that it would sting our hands. And basically like slapping a rock. That would be like the hysteresis, or the rate of induction, which basically is nothing more fancy than saying how fast can you slap the water before it doesn't hurt your hands. Like, well, if I go at x speed, then I've hit it so hard and so fast that due to the surface tension of the medium, in this case the water, it feels like I'm smacking a rock, and it's painful. You don't do that. If you do it at a certain speed, you could drag your hand through the water no problem. And this is the hysteresis and the rate of induction at which something is moving, because it moves against a medium. Sound is not an emission. Nikola Tesla famously said that that light is nothing other than a sound wave in the ether. Well, sound is not an emission. It's actually a disturbance of a medium. It's the rate of induction, or the hysteresis, the maximum rate at which the medium can be disturbed. That fundamentally is what hysteresis and induction is. This brass flywheel on this gyroscope, this is actually made in England, they don't make it anymore, is not very different from the magnetic flywheel. We could actually forget about the aluminum casing and the actual axle that goes through the brass flywheel. Completely ignore that and just take a look at the flywheel itself. All the atoms in the flywheel are themselves, since all atoms are magnetodielectric dynamos, are point source. But since all the atoms in the gyroscopic, in this case the brass flywheel, are operating coherently, it causes a reaction in the ether. And there is a lag, and then there is polarity. Magnetism, of course, as I've said, is the dielectric field. Well, it's this three-dimensional force vector. You take a piece of wire, you could bend it like an S if you want to know what a three-dimensional force vector looks like, and bend each end inverse to one another, and then you actually have a three-dimensional force vector. But the lag created due to the hysteresis of all these countless billions of atoms that make up the brass flywheel are actually churning up the ether. I'm not generating electricity. Of course, if I spun this up and put a copper reflector and like a three-phase or four-phase coil and built it around it, of course I would be generating electricity. But it is still causing a reaction in the ether. Oops, let me get my microphone cord caught up in the Dremel tool here. Okay. I set it up here on the top of my hand. Try to hold my hand as steady as possible. It doesn't matter if I put this on a bookcase or something that's not moving. And of course my skin is slightly moving. I hold it like this. All the atoms of this brass flywheel, if we take a near-perfect analogy of the magnetic field, are causing a reaction in the medium. And the reaction in the medium can only react so fast. This is the reason for the assumed, which is not a speed, because light is not an emission. It is not a speed, it is a rate of induction, or a hysteresis of the medium, just as the so-called speed of sound, which is not a speed, it's a hysteresis of the medium, occurs. So all the atoms of this brass flywheel are reacting with the medium around it. And the hysteresis causes a lag. Not only that, the top of the flywheel and the bottom of the flywheel are actually fighting against each other. We actually have a polaric effect in the case of the magnetic flywheel, which is a flywheel, except of course it's a field flywheel. It is reacting to the rate of induction or the hysteresis of the medium of that field, which of course it itself is. We have reactions of ice floating in water, and of course ice is water. We know that what the tip of the iceberg is only 10% visible, and the rest of it is about 90% below the surface. But there's a reaction between the two due to many different factors. Magnetism's geometry, of course, as you very well know, is a torus. But it is a field torus, unlike this brass flywheel, which of course is a conglomeration of countless atoms that make up the brass, which is what? Copper and, depends on the brass, copper, aluminum, zinc. I forgot the actual composition of fundamental brass. I forget, like 70% copper. That's not very important. But the field torus of the magnetic field, of course, it is churning once again at the average mean speed of 42 million hertz, or 42 megahertz. Magnetism, of course, is subject to several parameters: counter space, mutual polarity torsion, ether drag, the rate of induction of the medium, which of course is the ether. The gyroscopic effect, by the way, that everybody is so fascinated by, doesn't take into effect, and there's nobody online that says this. I've seen all the fascinating gyroscopic videos, and someone will have a really heavy weight at the end of a long pole. They can't lift it up, but once you spin it up, you can lift. Oh, look at this fascinating gyroscopic effect. It's actually reduced weight, where before, when it was just sitting there, I couldn't lift it. But now that I've actually spun it up, I can lift it, and there's countless videos like that, and nobody explains that principle, by the way. They keep thinking in terms of the actual gyroscope itself, its speed. They'll talk about angular momentum, which is descriptively accurate, but it is not explicative. In other words, it doesn't explain anything. There's a lot of, you say, well, how does the gyroscope lose weight? Well, it's angular momentum, it's conservation of angular momentum, and it's preservation of the torque, and but they don't explain anything. They can't fundamentally tell you how it loses weight. Of course, weight has many different variables. I've talked about that before endlessly. One factor of weight in magnetism and the magnetic field, and by the way, when two magnets come together, that's not magnetism, as I've said a million times. That's dielectric acceleration. I got a perfect little example right here, and I dare you to explain it. This is a rather large magnet. It's a 1-inch neodymium iron boron. If you actually took this little tiny magnet and put it on a scale, put a scale around it and you tied it to a string that was able to measure what it weighed, it's like, okay, it weighs 3 grams, tiny little magnet. Okay, well that's fine, but do you know that weight has a minimum of 7 different variables? Weight is specific to location, to field, to vector, to spatial coherency, to magnitude of the mass. The closer the location, the greater the weight. If you're actually able to change for half the location of one of the objects, you're able to double. I can hear the thunder and lightning outside. You're able to change the weight. The same thing is going on with a magnetic field. Now, say if I have a little scale attached to this little tiny magnet, I don't know if you can see it, and get it actually closer to this larger. Well, over here it weighs 3 grams. Well, I know you can't see that, but you can see maybe that it's sucking in towards my finger. The closer I actually get it to this other magnet, the more it's actually accelerating. People say, well, and this is a fallacy everybody on Earth makes except for me, literally. People say, well, this is a magnet. Yeah, okay, what about the magnet? Well, it has a magnetic field around it. Well, that's accurate. So when two magnets are accelerating towards one another, since they have a magnetic field around them, what's happening is magnetic attraction. It's like, no. There's no such thing as magnetic attraction. What dominates magnetism is dielectricity. Magnetism is a dielectric field. It's kind of like unintelligent little school children being fascinated by the puppet show, but they can't see the people that are operating the puppets with their hands up in the puppets. They can't see that. They don't recognize. The only thing they see are the puppets. The same thing with ignorant human beings that only recognize the magnetic field. They can't actually see what's controlling the puppets. The puppet being analogous to magnetism, and the dielectric being, the hand up the puppet controlling the puppet. But the weight on this will actually increase on this tiny little magnet. I think it's something like about multiplicative of about 4 or 5. You can actually see it sucking in my finger here. It's like, well, people think weight is one thing. Well, by changing the location, by changing the fact that we have field coherency and mutually assured destruction of the magnetic field, which is what dielectricity wants to do, which of course is that hole at the center of every magnet as you see underneath the supercell, which I've got thousands of videos of. Everybody's seen that. Countless videos that got that big black hole right there. It's like, well, why did the weight change on this if you're able to attach a little scale to it and measure the weight? It's like, it was 3 grams over here, but when I hovered it over the magnet, all of a sudden it weighs a whole lot more. Did the weight actually change? It's the exact same thing. It's like, well, I don't understand. It's like, well, weight, just like magnetism, and I'm making a near perfect analogy here regarding the magnetic flywheel, okay? Is it's specific to location, to field. In this case, I demonstrated that. To a vector, well, the weight change drastically increased by putting a specific field underneath this little tiny I think it's like 3 grams, this little 3-gram magnet. It's like, you know, why did the weight drastically ramp up? By changing the field that's underneath it. There's nothing there. There's nothing measurable. It's not particles going on, and certainly not as what they say, virtual photons, which is completely arbitrary insanity. I mean, it's just crazy. What? Virtual photons? Yeah, no, Nope, 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 nope. So magnetism is subject to counter space, mutual polarity torsion, ether drag, the rate of induction, and of course spatial volume. What's going on is field torque. The actual polarity phase shift due to ether drag, which has many different variables, of which I just named 5 of them, makes possible charge, polarity, life, self-assemblage of oxygen and hydrogen. There's a little, that requires its own video, which of course is the basis and necessity for life. This creates time. This creates space. This is what makes life possible. The list for this actually goes on and on and on and on. The magnetic flywheel, which has a phase disparity. I've shown this with redshift and blue shift of magnetic fields underneath white light. Doesn't matter if it's sunlight or LED light. The south pole is compressed, and it has a compression of 1.618 to the north pole, which is proportionality to 1. You actually take an egg and you subdivide it. The pointy end volume is a volume of phi, or 1.618, to the southern or fat bottom of the egg being a proportionality of volume equal to 1. The same thing is true in life. We actually get closer to rest or to death. We get more retrospective. We're more active. This is why time also, too, dilates. You notice as you get older, time seems to move really quickly. You'll notice young people think time is dragging. They have a lot more time. It's because they do. And when you get older and you get closer to rest, which of course is the center, time seems to fly. And it's like, well, for the first 35, 40 years of your life, you experience time under phi, and then it gets lesser and lesser and lesser and lesser. It happens so slowly you don't notice it. By the time you're my age and 60 and 70, time, every old person, that time flies by. It is flying by. By the way, this is a secret to why time appears to fly when you get older. There's nobody online that will give you that answer. The first person that you would hear or read about that is me in this video, but I didn't, mean to harp on that in this video. The Earth, of course, is processing. It takes the Earth about 26,000 years to complete a circular wobble. The flywheel, the magnetic flywheel, of course, is processing. This gyroscopic precession is due to ether reaction, which, of course, necessitatively follows the right-hand rule. When this brass flywheel is not just spinning in the air is completely irrelevant. Yeah? We have a reaction of the hysteresis, the rate of induction, at which something will move in and of this invisible medium, which is there, but there implies a topos, a place in space and time. Look, I can point to it. Well, can you point to the ether? It doesn't exist because I can't point to it. Well, you can't point to your love for your mother or your dog or your cat, But you love your mother or your dog or your cat because you can't point to it. Look, there's love. Like, no, you can't point to it. It's just, they use the same sort of, radical absurdity and countless things that they admit to be true, but just because they can't point out Objectively, that which is, of course, subjective by nature. They think it doesn't exist, but that's a matter for another video and talking about does the ether exist or does not the ether exist, and of course I make countless videos about that. What we actually have in the case of the magnetic flywheel, this toroidal flywheel, is one end of the stick, and of course by the stick I'm meaning the axis or the top of the flywheel versus the bottom of the flywheel, or the north pole or south pole of the magnet, or in this case the gyroscope, being dragged by the other because they're both joined. One kind of near perfect analogy, and people do get this, is you have a car that's flying around a corner really fast. So you know this. Around a corner, following the toroidal geometry. Imagine, of course, the car is flying around the torus here. If I actually expand this torus out a little bit so where it actually has a volume, we have the top hand here and the bottom hand, of course, here. It's flying around this gyroscope. As it's flying around this three-dimensional S-curve, to be able to paint it in your mind, you know the car on the inside curve will lift off. If, of course, you go too fast, it will absolutely lift off and completely fly off the track. But you'll notice that the wheels on the inner curve will lift off, where we actually have rarefaction. The closer something is to the center, the closer you are to rest. And, of course, where we have less drag, less time, less compression, of course, the outer wheels are greatly increasing in pressure. This is true. You can actually feel the car lift off when you take which of course you shouldn't do that, take this radical turn at high speed. And of course 42 million hertz is some pretty high speed. But that's what magnetism is. It's the three-dimensional force vector of the loss of energy or inertia of the dielectric. There's an ancient saying in Polarity that says, when this is present, that is present. When this is not present, that is not present. So in flying around the toroidal flywheel in the car that is the magnetic vector, you're lifting off and rarefying the pressure on one side of the car. As you know, it will lift off. Yeah, and the outer edge will, of course, compress. And if I can actually see far enough ahead on the road, I know there's nobody there, I'll actually drive my car on the other side of the road because there is less lifting off, there's less angular momentum where my body is being pushed to the outer corner of the car. Of course, you know this as well as I do. This is kind of a near-perfect analogy in talking about the magnetic flywheel and the actual effects that are created. And people have asked me for years and years, like, why is there effect? Because I've done endless experiments, and I've had literally thousands of you do the experiments where you've done seed experiments, and South Pole, we actually have compression of time. We actually have 1.6 times as much time on the South Pole of the magnet than we do the North Pole. You do North Pole exposure, seeds bad. They smell bad, they taste bad, they grow bad, they germinate bad. Literally thousands of people have done that experiment. Literally thousands. I didn't believe you, but I thought, this guy's not selling anything. I got to try. It's like, oh my God, it works. I'm getting, you can make tomatoes more acidic or less acidic just by seed exposure only from North Pole or South Pole. This, of course, is ether drag in the case of the magnetic flywheel. The drag, of course, is also the very reason why this thing that you think is the speed of light, IEC, exists. This so-called speed is not a speed. It's a hysteresis, or the rate of induction, of one thing against another. When the magnetic flywheel is spinning up, no different than this brass flywheel, the only thing you see is this gyroscope, but you're not seeing it actually spinning and causing a reaction, which causes it to precess. That precession is caused because the ether is reacting to that. We have field coherency of endless billions of point source atoms making up the brass flywheel, which causes a reaction in the ether, which causes precession, which causes phase disparity. This is the basis for time, space, life, charge, cathode, anode. The idea that a magnet has two poles. A magnet has its north pole and its south pole. It's like a battery. We got the positive here and we got the negative over here. I'm pretty sure this is the battery. This thing that you think is the positive here and the negative here, and that is the positive and negative. You got to wire a battery up correctly to be able to use it, right? So you're superficially accurate, but you're fundamentally wrong. This whole thing is the freaking battery. I know you're talking about the cathode here and the anode over here. But why is that the case? Well, it's because a magnet has polarity. I've done that magnetic seed exposure experiment too, and you're right, it does work. I'm like, well, why does it work? Well, I don't know. A magnet does not have poles. A magnet has the inversion of counter space. Let's go on to part 2 of this video, and we'll join the two together. Okay? Thanks. It'll be a short little bit. Had a lightning strike in the backyard. Kind of had to end the video to make sure there was no damage out there. There's a bad lightning storm going on outside. Ooh! The simple questions are so connected. The connectivity of absolutely everything is 100% undeniable. The only thing that actually falls within the parameters of plausible Occam's razor is that everything is connected. A magnet does not have a north pole and a south pole. Well, sure it does. Everybody knows that. Well, you haven't even defined the word energy. You haven't even defined the word field. I keep pointing out to people, ooh, listen to that lightning. Ooh-wee! I love lightning except when it knocks the power out, which it might do in this video. You never know. But a magnet doesn't have that. Most people don't know, including any of these PhD professors of science, that the magnetic field on the South Pole is compressed and blue shifted, and the magnetic field on the North Pole is rarefied. Proportionality of 1 to 5. Well, why is this? Both ends of a flywheel cannot spin at the same rate. The larger the flywheel, the more the issue, spatially so. And these, of course, are the vectors, the parameters that actually define the magnetic torus, and also, too, gravity. Like I said, gravity is location, field, vector, spatial coherency, magnitude of the mass, and there are a few other parameters. Just as magnetism is subject to counter space, mutual polarity torsion, ether drag, the rate of induction relative to the magnitude of the magnetic field. As I've shown you, I've actually got some really powerful, I think I got one over here somewhere. No, I don't have it over here. I don't know where it is. Really powerful magnet has a really large black spot when you put it underneath the ferrocell. Super powerful magnet has a smaller spatial field. Power is equal to counter space, i.e. rest. Energy, release of energy specifically, and people can't wrap their brain around rest, is equal to spatiality. Yeah. The more powerful a magnet gets, the more and more the magnetic field around it shrinks. If you're able to dial up a magnet to endless billions of times higher than it is, it will vanish from the physical universe. This is where dielectricity overthrows magnetism's ability to keep any physical objective matter within this universe. So both ends, which of course can't spin at the same rate, this of course is equal to volume. This is the drag of inertia. This is literally field gravity. That thing that you've been, and every foolish human being has been calling magnetic attraction for thousands of years, that's not magnetism at all. That's dielectricity. There ain't no such thing as magnetic attraction. Magnetism, by definition, is centrifugal force and motion. Yeah? Increasing inertia and acceleration, which is centripetal, which is a drive towards rest, of course, is a dielectric. In the toroidal flywheel that actually makes up the magnetic flywheel, we have a lot of different factors that actually affect and cause the manifestation of the rate of induction or the hysteresis of the medium of that gyroscopic procession. Everybody can kind of wrap their brain around a torus, but what they're failing to see or understand, this is kind of hard to hold, this little sucker, this toroidal slinky is called a toroflex. They're like $10 on Amazon or eBay, there we go, is that this thing is spinning at 42 million, depends on how large it is, several different factors affect its Lamore frequency, 42 million hertz. Well, just like the brass flywheel starts to process, which of course it does, it's processing because it's actually churning up the ether. I'm not generating any power that way because the only thing I have here is a brass flywheel. Can't say that. I'll edit that out. A brass flywheel. We'll say, why is it processing? Well, it's angular momentum in the mass. And I love when you actually look up the answers of why there's actually precession at all. So what is the magnetic moment of the precession of the mass? You're not explaining anything. You're actually giving accurate descriptions and you're providing the equation, but you're not actually explaining what's happening. It's like, why does it start to precess? Why? All of the atoms that are making up the brass flywheel are actually churning up a medium. And when you churn something up, you cause a reaction. When you you know, you rarefy, if you got a piece of rope and you got, you know, a little person on one end and a super powerful person on the other, when you compress one end, you cause a rarefaction on the other. Everything is connected. The magnetic and the dielectric of the toroidal flywheel that makes up magnetism is always in a fight with counter space. Force is at odds with and in fight with inertia. Centrifugal magnetic flux is at fight with centripetal inertia. The magnetic is at fight with the dielectric. This is the reason why there is a phase disparity. This is the reason why there's red shift and blue shift. This is the reason why time exists. Without this phase disparity of the reaction of the medium, of the magnetic flywheel, which is the dielectric field, life would not exist, charge would not exist, polarity would not exist, procession would not exist. Everything that makes everything possible, well, about 98%, would be impossible without that phase disparity. This flywheel procession that is reacting with the medium, that it itself is a modality thereof. This kind of makes people's eyes cross and they think I'm making things complicated, when I'm pausing every second to make it as simple as possible. And yet someone will still say, you're using big words. I was like, no, I'm really not. If you think I am, I got a glossary below, by the way. And by the way, if you like this video, any donation is always warmly welcome of any variety. That's in the description of this video. I greatly appreciate any donation at all, very, very greatly so. Was that a shameless plug? It probably was, but I actually do mean it. The magnetic field is already a rotating flywheel, but when you rotate something, you cause something else to happen. This angular momentum, just like driving your car around this tight curve at high speed. You know, one side of the car will lift off, and the other side, the actual pressure on the tires will greatly increase. Race car drivers, I think it's true that they only replace like one side of the tires after X number of laps because they're always going in the same motion, around the track, so they replace one side of the tires because they wear infinitely quicker. I'm 99.9% certain that's accurate. That's the phase disparity of tire wear on race cars. It's like, well, our four tires are on the ground. Why is one side wearing drastically more than the other? That would be like a phase disparity of tire wear in a race car track driver. You know, after 100 laps or whatever. You know, the right side tires are worn out. The inside tires are okay. This phase disparity of the lag, of the hysteresis, of that spinning medium, is reactive into and of the medium of which it is a modality thereof. This sounds complicated, but it's actually hyper simple. As I've said humorously many countless times, Mother Nature really is a hairy armpit chick with muddy feet. By the way, there's no math. There are ratios and proportionalities in the universe. The universe is not painted with math, as a lot of men like to think. Math is the only true universal. There is no calculator of math in Mother Nature. Mother Nature only knows capacitance, resistance, permeability, and permittivity. But you could simplify that up even more so by saying Mother Nature only knows pressure mediation. You could say Mother Nature only knows centrifugal divergence and centripetal convergence. But this churning medium, i.e. the toroidal magnetic field, is also, too, mutually reactive with the medium of which it is and the medium in which it is turning. And this is why we have polarity. This is why we have phase disparity. This is why we have life, charge, discharge, capacitance. This is that which makes all things possible. And that's not my opinion, not my feeling, not my belief. That is the core fundamental secret in a nutshell. If you want some big words, I could use some big words. Nobody will like it, and they would think I'm trying to like impress it. You're trying to impress people with big words. No, I'm not. Point is to get the, to get the message across, to cause comprehension and insight. You're never trying to, unless you're actually evil, trying to befuddle and confuse people with supercalifragilistic words. That doesn't help anybody. And if you're trying to impress anybody by doing that, then you're wrong on every level. I'm never trying to do that. That's why I pause like every 5 seconds. Like, what's an easier way to state this to cause comprehension? I think the car going around the track would be pretty good. Which it is, but also, too, the case of weight. When I had the little magnet above the big magnet, why didn't you tell me why? And, by the way, that dielectric acceleration, which is not magnetic attraction at all, why do you think that the weight changes drastically higher the closer you actually get the small magnet to the big magnet? I halved the distance between the two and the weight quadrupled. Explain that. There's not a PhD professor of physics in this entire world that will explain that to you. I thought you said weight was weight. You know? Weight is measured at sea level. There actually are gravitometers, which actually will change very super slightly. Like if you're at sea level versus a mountaintop, the gravity, they're really expensive, super high precision instruments. Well, the gravity changes. You've gone up to altitude. It's like, yeah, that's true. Can you explain it? Well, not really. It's some complicated math. You won't understand it. Yeah. Isn't it amazing that the magnetic flywheel makes everything possible, that makes life possible, the creation? And of course, time doesn't exist. Time is a measure. But we actually have a disparity. I got a fly here on my amethyst crystal. A disparity between the North Pole and the South Pole. We actually have more time, 1.6 times more time on the South Pole than we do on the North Pole. This is how birds actually navigate. They don't actually see magnetism directly. They actually see North Pole and South Pole magnetic effect on light, red shift and blue shift. Even if they only see in grayscale and not in color, they're still able to see the shift. That is how birds navigate. That was my discovery, by the way. You're welcome. I discovered that many years ago. That's how they navigate. We've known that birds navigate via magnetism, but no bird on Earth can see magnetism. What they do is they actually see magnetic polarity's effect on visible light. That's a discovery I made like 8 years ago or something like that. But this flywheel has many different parameters that make possible everything that's important. Charge, life, procession, cathode, anode. And this is one of the great fundamental secrets of the magnetic field. So, well, a magnetic field is toroidal. I've heard it from that, tattooed bald guy many times. I understand a torus. Like, you don't understand that it's also, too, rotating. And when it rotates, it is interacting with the unseen or invisible medium that is the ether. And that causes phase disparity. It causes red shift and blue shift. It causes all things that are both important and destructive. This is also, too, like I said, the reason why we think time is flying when we get older. It's like, man, when I was younger, time moved around like a constipated tortoise. Now when I'm older, time moves like a jackrabbit that just had 10 cups of coffee. Like, what's wrong? That's the reason why. The North Pole is closer to rest. The South Pole is furthest from rest, or the plane of inertia. As we get older, we're approaching the North Pole, further and further into it. We're approaching rest. There's far less time, which is why time dilates for older people. That's the secret of that, by the way. Thank you so much for watching. If you ever like these videos or want to contact me, the information is below. Any donations are always warmly welcome. I hope you have a lovely day. Man, it is thundering and lightning outside like crazy. I love thunder and lightning, as long as it doesn't knock the power out.